You don't hide pain. Well, the Apache woman said, and the cowboy went completely still. The tap of a wooden cane echoed through the silver Dollar Saloon, like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something terrible. March 1886. Bitter Springs, Arizona Territory. A man walked through the bat-wing doors with movements so careful, so deliberate, that every head turned to watch. His eyes stared at nothing milky white, unfocused. The eyes of a man who hadn't seen sunlight in years. He wore the dust-colored clothes of a drifter, unremarkable in every way, except for those dead eyes and the cane that preceded each step like a blind man's prayer. The bartender, a thick-necked German named Heinrich, sighed the sigh of a man who'd seen too many broken souls drift through his doors. "Whiskey, friend." The blind man nodded, feeling his way to the corner table, the one with its back to the wall. Though what good that did. A man who couldn't see an ambush coming was anyone's guess. He counted coins by touch, sliding them across the bar with fingers that moved like spider legs across silk. Much obliged. His voice was soft, defeated. The voice of a man who had stopped fighting the world and simply let it wash over him. The regulars went back to their cards and their lies. A blind man was furniture. Less than furniture. At least you could sit on a chair. None of them noticed the way his head tilted slightly when the bat-wing doors swung open again. None of them saw how his fingers stopped their restless drumming on the table for exactly 3 heartbeats before resuming. None of them knew they were sharing whiskey with a ghost. Elijah Stone had been dead for 3 years. Not the kind of dead where they put you in the ground and say nice things about you. The other kind. The kind where you wake up every morning and have to remind yourself to breathe, to eat, to pretend you're still among the living. Before he died, he'd been someone else entirely. They called him the Pale Rider. Not because of the horse he rode that was black as coal black as the dreams that still woke him screaming in the night. They called him that because of what followed in his wake. Death. Swift, certain, and utterly without mercy for those who deserved none. He'd been a bounty hunter, but not the kind who chased down horse thieves and card cheats for drinking money. Elijah Stone hunted the monsters that regular law couldn't touch, the wealthy murderers who bought judges like cattle, the slavers who operated in plain sight, the men whose crimes were so terrible that decent folk pretended not to. See, for 12 years he'd been the shadow that even shadows feared. The duster coat he wore back then was gray, as ash long enough to hide the arsenal, beneath 2 Colt Peacemakers in shoulder holsters, plus the main iron, riding low on his right hip, tied down with leather cord. A professional's rig, the kind of setup that shaved precious fractions off a draw because in his line of work fractions were the difference between walking away and being carried. His eyes had been the color of winter sky, pale blue cold, assessing every man he met like a carpenter measuring wood for a coffin. And his hands. God, his hands had been steady. They said he could light a match at 30 paces, shoot the wings off a fly at 20. Exaggeration mostly. But not by much. The legend of the Pale Rider was written in blood across half of Texas. They still talked about the Crawford brothers in El Paso. 4 men holed up in an abandoned ranch house responsible for 11 deaths in a train robbery, including 3 women and 2 children, who'd made the mistake of looking out the windows when the shooting started. Every lawman in the territory knew where the Crawfords were hiding. None of them went after them. 4 professional killers in a fortified position, each with a reputation for shooting first and never bothering with questions. That was suicide, not justice. Elijah Stone rode out alone. He didn't kick down the door, didn't announce himself with a sheriff's star or a warrant. He simply appeared at the edge of rifle range and waited. 3 days. 3 days in the Arizona sun, without fire, without smoke, without anything to mark his position. He lived on jerky and water from his canteen, never moving, barely, breathing, watching. On the 4th night, the eldest Crawford made a run for it. New moon, no light, as close to invisible as a man could get. Elijah shot him at 200 yards. 1 shot. In complete darkness. The 3 remaining brothers surrendered at dawn. They'd rather face the rope than whatever devil was hunting them from the shadows. But here's the part the legends don't tell. When they got to El Paso, all 3 hanged themselves in their cells before the trial. The guards found them at sunrise, feet dangling, faces, purple eyes staring at something only dead men could see. The official report said they feared the hangman. Anyone who'd seen Elijah Stone's eyes knew better. They feared seeing those eyes again in the courtroom. There were rules to the Pale Rider's work. Lines he wouldn't cross. A rancher once offered $5,000, a fortune enough to buy a spread and live easy for 20 years to handle a group of escaped slaves heading north through the territory. Elijah didn't say a word, just looked at the rancher with those pale winter eyes until the man started sweating, then turned his horse and rode away. A week later, they found the rancher hanging from the oak tree in front of his own house. The county sheriff ruled it suicide. Nobody disagreed, not out loud, not even the rancher's own family. The pale rider hunted monsters. He did not hunt people whose only crime was wanting to be free. That was his one rule. The only thing that made him different from the creatures he destroyed. He met Elena in San Antonio the spring of '81. She was working in a milliner's shop making hats for ladies who had never worked a day in their lives. Mexican father, Irish mother with hair like midnight and eyes that saw straight through every wall a man could build around his heart. Their first conversation, "You're the one they call the Pale Rider." No fear in her voice, just stating a fact like saying the sky was blue. "I've been called that. They say you kill men for money. I kill men who need killing. The money's just how I keep score." She should have walked away. Any sensible woman would have. But Elena had never been sensible. She'd grown up in a border town where death was a neighbor you nodded to each morning, and she'd learned early that sometimes the most dangerous-looking men were the ones who'd give their last dollar to a hungry child. She looked at Elijah Stone, looked past the cold eyes and the gunfighter's rig and the reputation written in blood, and saw something nobody else had seen in years. A man who was tired. A man who wanted more than anything to stop. They were married 3 months later. Rosa came a year after that, a squalling, red-faced miracle with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. Elijah bought a small ranch outside San Antonio, hung up the duster coat, put the Colts in a chest under the bed, and tried, God help him, he tried to become someone else. A farmer, a husband, a father. For 2 years, he almost believed he could do it. The fire came on a Tuesday night in August. Elijah was in El Paso tracking a lead on a man named Senator Thomas Whitmore, a respectable politician with a respectable family who secretly ran the largest child trafficking operation in the Southwest. Children disappeared from border towns, from orphanages, from families too poor to make noise when their babies vanished. They were sold to mining camps, to brothels in Mexico, to places so dark that death was a mercy. Elijah had been gathering evidence for 6 months, careful, patient, building a case that even Whitmore's bought judges couldn't dismiss. He should have known that kind of evil doesn't wait to be caught. Whitmore's men found the ranch while Elijah was 200 miles away. They came at midnight with torches and coal oil, and they didn't leave until there was nothing left but ashes and bone. Elena, Rosa, the horses, the barn, the house Elijah had built with his own hands, everything. The sheriff called it an accident. Oil lamp knocked over in the night. Tragic, but these things happen. Elijah knew better. He found Whitmore's name in the ashes of his life written in the boot prints of men who hadn't bothered to hide their tracks, in the whispered confessions of witnesses too scared to speak, until the Pale Rider came calling. What happened next took 6 months. 14 men died. Elijah killed them one by one, starting with the men who'd carried the torches and working his way up the chain. He was thorough, methodical. Each kill was a message to the next name on his list: I'm coming. You can't hide. You can't run. You can only decide how much you want to suffer before the end. Senator Thomas Whitmore was the last. Elijah shot him in the chest in broad daylight in front of 200 witnesses at a political rally. Didn't try to escape. Didn't resist when they slapped the irons on him. He'd already decided the killing was done. Let them hang him. At least he'd see Elena and Rosa again. But Whitmore's friends had other plans. They couldn't let Elijah Stone talk in a courtroom. Too many secrets would come out. Too many powerful men would fall. So they arranged an accident. 3 guards beat him in his cell the night before the trial. Beat him until his face was unrecognizable. Until his ribs cracked like dry branches. Until they destroyed his eyes. Not blindness from illness or injury. They held him down and poured something burning into his face, something that seared away his sight and left him screaming in a darkness that would never end. Then they threw him in the river and told the newspapers that the notorious outlaw Pale Rider had drowned while trying to escape justice. Case closed. Senator Whitmore buried with honors. Evil won, as evil so often does. But Elijah Stone didn't drown. He washed up on a sandbar 3 miles downstream, blind and broken and more dead than alive. A Yaqui medicine woman found him there. She nursed him back to something resembling life over 6 months of agony and fever dreams. When he could finally walk again, he made a decision. The pale rider was dead. Let him stay dead. Elijah Stone, the blind man, the watchmaker, then nobody would take his place. He learned to walk with a cane, learned to navigate by sound and touch and memory, used plant dyes to keep his eyes looking clouded, though the truth was they'd healed enough to see shapes and shadows, then more than almost everything. But nobody needed to know that. A blind man was invisible, harmless, beneath notice. And Elijah Stone, he was tired. So tired of blood and death and the weight of a gun in his hand. He wanted to disappear, to stop, to let the world spin on without him while he sat in the dark and waited for death to finally catch up. For 8 months in Bitter Springs, that's exactly what he did. Until the night he heard a child crying. It started with the wagon train. Elijah was in his usual spot, corner table, back to the wall, whiskey growing warm in his hand when he heard the horses. Too many of them moving too fast for regular travelers. His head tilted. The old instincts never really died, no matter how hard he tried to bury them. 6 horses. Heavy loads. At least one wagon with iron axles based on the squeaking. The bat-wing doors swung open, and a voice that carried authority and cruelty in equal measure boomed through the saloon. Drinks for my men. We're celebrating Thomas Henderson. Elijah had heard the name whispered around town. Wealthy trader, well-connected, brought goods through from Mexico that made him rich and other men afraid. The kind of goods that screamed in the night. The kind of goods that were sold by the head. Elijah's fingers tightened on his glass. Not your business, he told himself. You're dead. The pale rider is dead. Let someone else fight this war. He kept his head down, his eyes unfocused, the perfect picture of a blind man lost in his own small darkness. Then Henderson walked past his table close enough for Elijah to smell the trail dust and something else. Something that made his blood freeze. Mesquite smoke. Coal oil. The particular scent of fire used to burn villages, and underneath it the copper tang of blood fresh enough that it couldn't be more than a few hours old. What's wrong with him? Henderson asked, gesturing at Elijah. Blind man Heinrich said from behind the bar. Watchmaker. Harmless. Henderson grunted. Even a blind beggar can buy a round. Pour him something on my tab. Thank you kindly, sir, Elijah said in the meek voice of a man who knew his place. God bless you. Henderson laughed. God's got nothing to do with my business, old man. He moved on to his table, and Elijah sat very still, barely breathing, cataloging every sound. 6 men. Heavy boots, spurs, at least 4 wearing gun leather. One of them had a limp right leg, probably old injury. 2 of them were drunk, already laughing too loud at Henderson's jokes. The last one was quiet, professional. The one Elijah would have to kill first if killing needed doing. But killing didn't need doing. That life was over. He finished his whiskey, paid Heinrich, and made his slow way toward the door cane, tapping out his path like a heartbeat. Then he heard the wagon. Not through the walls of the saloon, sound didn't carry that well. But when he pushed through the bat-wing doors, he could feel it. The creak of wood, the stamp of horses, and something else. The sound of chains. Elijah stopped on the boardwalk, his head tilted like a man, trying to remember something he'd forgotten. The wagon stood in front of the general store canvas cover pulled tight against the Arizona night. 2 of Henderson's men stood guard rifles across their chests, the casual posture of men who didn't expect trouble. From inside the canvas came a sound that drove a spike through what was left of Elijah Stone's heart. Weeping. Soft. Muffled. The weeping of a child. He should have walked away. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to go back to his room, to pretend he hadn't heard, to let the world's evil flow past him like water around a stone. But then came another sound. A woman's voice, fierce and low. Little one, I'm here. I won't let them hurt you. The voice was speaking Diné Navajo, a language Elijah had learned from a scout named Red Horse years ago in another life. The words meant nothing to Henderson's guards, but to Elijah they meant everything. He walked past the wagon, his cane tapping steadily, his face the blank mask of a man who saw nothing because there was nothing to see. And as he passed, he let his cane strike the wagon wheel once, twice. A pause in the weeping inside. Then, barely above a whisper in the same Navajo tongue, I hear you. I will return. He didn't know if they understood him. Didn't know if his accent was too Anglo, too broken from years of disuse. But the weeping stopped, and that was something. He made his way back to his room above the watch shop, closed the door, and sat in the darkness for a very long time. The rational part of his mind was screaming, walk away. You can't save everyone. You couldn't even save your own family. What makes you think you can save strangers? But another voice was speaking now. A smaller voice, younger, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. Papa. Papa, why didn't you save us? Elijah stood up. His hands moved to the loose floorboard in the corner, the one he checked every night to make sure his past was still buried. He pulled out a chest wrapped in oilcloth black wood with brass fittings heavy with memory and death. Inside, the gray duster coat folded neat as a shroud, the twin Colts in their shoulder holsters, the gun belt with its low-slung holster leather cord for tie-down still supple after 3 years, 24 rounds copper-jacketed, each one a promise, and at the bottom, wrapped in Elena's favorite handkerchief, the Pale Rider's last mask. Black leather, covering the upper half of the face with holes for eyes that everyone thought could no longer see. Elijah held the mask in his hands for a long moment. "You're dead," he told himself. "Stay dead." But then the memory of that child's weeping cut through him again, and he understood something he'd been hiding from since the night they burned his family. Death wasn't a punishment. Death was easy. Living watching evil triumph while you sat in the dark and did nothing that was the real hell. Elena wouldn't want him to die for her memory. She'd want him to live, to fight, to save the children who still had a chance. Elijah Stone put on his dead man's clothes, and the Pale Rider rose from his grave. AT20. In the morning, Bitter Springs slept the sleep of a town that knew better than to notice certain things. Henderson's men had retired to the hotel, all except the 2 guards on the wagon. They'd built a small fire and were passing a bottle between them, comfortable in the assumption that nothing in this sleepy town could threaten them. They were wrong. Elijah moved through the shadows like smoke, each step placed with the precision of a man who'd spent years learning how to approach death without making a sound. The gray duster was tucked tight against his body, the twin Colts secure in their shoulder. Holsters, the main gun riding low on his right hip. He didn't need the cane anymore. Didn't need the shuffling walk of a blind man. 3 years of pretending had been washed away in the time it took to buckle on a gun belt. He circled wide, approaching from downwind, and waited. The guards talked in low voices. About women. About the money Henderson paid them. About the cargo they were hauling and what it would fetch in Mexico. "The Navajo woman's a fighter," one said. "Nearly took my eye out when we grabbed her. Henderson'll break her. He breaks all of them." And the kids, shrug. "Kids are worth more. Mines pay good money for small hands. They can get into places grown men can't." Elijah's jaw tightened. His hand drifted to his Colt. No, not yet. Too much noise. Too many variables. He waited until the bottle made its 4th pass, until both men's words started slurring, until one of them stood up to relieve himself against a nearby post. Then he moved. The first guard died without knowing he was dead. One moment he was fumbling with his belt, the next there was a hand over his mouth and a knife across his throat. Elijah lowered the body, silently catching the man's rifle before it could clatter. The second guard heard something, maybe the soft gurgle of his friend's last breath, maybe just instinct, and turned. He saw a shadow standing where his partner should have been. A shadow wearing a gray duster and a black mask with eyes that reflected the firelight like a wolf's. What the Elijah hit him with the rifle butt. Once, twice. The man went down and stayed down. 30 seconds. 2 guards eliminated. No shots fired. The old skills hadn't faded at all. He moved to the wagon, knife out, and cut through the canvas cover. Inside, by the faint light of stars, he saw 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ages maybe 6 to 10, huddled together in one corner, their ankles chained to an iron ring, and in the other corner a woman. She was Navajo, maybe 25, with the high cheekbones and strong jaw of the Diné people. Even in chains, even with a bruise darkening her left eye and her lips split and swollen, she held herself like a warrior. Her eyes met Elijah's without fear. "You came back," she said in Navajo. "I keep my promises," he replied, his accent rough but understandable. He moved to the chains. "Hold still." The locks were simple iron, no match for a pick that had opened cells in 3 territories. Within a minute, the chains fell away. "The children first," the woman said. "Get them out." You'll do nothing but follow me," Elijah said. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Can you shoot?" A pause, then with something like respect. "Yes." "Then we're leaving. Now." Before Henderson's men wake up, he helped the children down from the wagon one by one. The smallest, the girl, maybe 6 years old, clung to the woman's hand and stared at Elijah with huge dark eyes. "Is he a spirit?" she whispered in Navajo. "Perhaps," the woman answered, "but he is our spirit tonight." They moved through the darkness, skirting pools of lamplight, heading for the livery stable, where Elijah had kept a horse for exactly this kind of emergency. The horse wasn't black anymore, too recognizable, but it was fast and knew its master's hand. They were 100 yards from safety when a light flared in the hotel window. Then a shout. Then the thunder of boots on stairs. "They know," Elijah said. "Run." The woman scooped up the smallest child. The two boys needed no urging. They ran like rabbits through the dark streets of Bitter Springs while behind them, Henderson's men spilled out of the hotel with guns drawn and murder in their eyes. Elijah didn't run. He turned, drawing his Colt in the same motion, and became for one frozen moment exactly what he'd been for 12 years, the Pale Rider, death in human form. The first man through the hotel door died with a bullet in his chest. The second tried to bring his rifle up and caught a round in the shoulder that spun him around and dropped him screaming. The third, the quiet professional Elijah had noticed in the saloon, was fast. Very fast. His shot cracked past Elijah's ear close enough to feel the heat, but not fast enough. Elijah's return shot took him through the throat. Elijah's voice rang out through the night, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Thomas Henderson, the wealthy trader, appeared in the doorway, flanked by his remaining men. His face was twisted with rage and something else, confusion. This was supposed to be a quiet little town. There weren't supposed to be men in black masks shooting up his crew. "Who the hell are you?" Henderson screamed. Elijah didn't answer. He was already moving, fading back into the shadows, buying time for the woman and children to reach the horses. Another shot. Then another. He returned fire as he retreated, not trying to kill now, just to suppress, to keep their heads down, to make them think about whether the next bullet had their name on it. Then he was at the livery, swinging up onto his horse, pulling the smallest child up in front of him while the woman mounted a second horse with the boys. "North," he shouted. 2 miles. "There's a canyon, follow the creek," they rode. Behind them, Bitter Springs erupted into chaos, men shouting, horses whinnying, the distant crack of rifle fire chasing them into the night. Elijah knew they'd be followed. Knew Henderson had enough men and enough grudges to chase them to the edge of the earth. But he also knew something else. He knew the canyon. Had scouted it months ago during those long, sleepless nights, when the old instincts wouldn't let him truly rest. Had prepared it as an emergency retreat, stocked with supplies and water and ammunition. If Henderson wanted a fight, he'd get one. And the Pale Rider was done running. The canyon was everything Elijah had remembered. Narrow entrance, high walls, good cover, and a small spring that trickled from the rock face at the back. He'd cached food and water here 6 months ago, along with a rifle and 200 rounds of ammunition. The preparation of a man who couldn't stop being what he was no matter how hard he tried. The woman's name was Kaya. She told him this as they settled the children in the sheltered hollow at the canyon's end as the first gray light of dawn painted the eastern sky with colors like bruises. "We are Diné," she said, using her people's name for themselves, "from the land near Chinley. Henderson's men raided our camp 3 days ago, killed the elders who tried to fight, took the young women and the children." "How many were there, originally?" 12 women. 15 children. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "I don't know where the others are now. Scattered. Sold. Dead, maybe." Elijah processed this information with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 100 battles. Henderson's a regular on this route. Yes. He trades with the Mexicans. Girls for guns, children for gold. Kaya's jaw tightened. "My sister was taken 2 years ago. I never saw her again. And you," I fought back. Stabbed one of his men in the arm with his own knife. Henderson decided I needed breaking before I could be sold. Elijah looked at her bruises, at the fierce pride that still burned in her eyes despite everything. "You're Diné," he said. "Your people don't break." For the first time, something like a smile flickered across Kaya's face. "No, we don't." The children were sleeping now, curled together like puppies for warmth. The smallest girl, her name was Ayana, Kaya said, which meant Eternal Blossom had finally stopped trembling. "They will come," Kaya said. "Henderson and his men. They won't let us go." "I know. You are one man. He has how many? 674 now. I killed 3 in town." Elijah moved to the canyon entrance, checking sightlines out of habit. "Probably less after we're done." Kaya was quiet for a moment. "Then in the saloon you were blind." I was pretending to be blind. Why, Elijah didn't answer immediately. The dawn was spreading now, gold and pink in the pale blue of a winter sky, the color his eyes used to be before the darkness came. "Because the man I used to be got people killed," he finally said. "People I loved. I thought if I stopped being him, if I became nobody, the killing would stop. Did it? No. The killing never stops. It just finds new victims. He turned to face her. Henderson would have sold you and those children into slavery. If I hadn't acted, you'd be on your way to Mexico right now to a life worse than death. Kaya nodded slowly. So you chose to act. I chose to stop hiding. There's a difference. Is there? Elijah didn't have an answer for that. They came at noon. Elijah heard them first, 6 horses picking their way up the creek bed, moving careful and slow. Henderson was no fool. He knew he was riding into a trap. Take the children deeper into the canyon, Elijah told Kaya. There's a hollow behind the waterfall. Stay there no matter what you hear. I can fight. I know you can. But if I fall, those children need you to get them to safety. He held out one of his Colts. Take this. If anyone comes through who isn't me, use it. Kaya took the gun, checked the cylinder with the ease of someone who'd handled weapons before. You'll come back? Maybe. No. She met his eyes, and there was something there, not hope exactly, but certainty. You'll come back. The spirits didn't save you from the river just to let you die in a canyon. Elijah almost smiled. The spirits had nothing to do with it. A Yaqui woman pulled me out of the water. Same thing Kaya said. The spirits work through human hands. She gathered the children and disappeared into the shadows at the back of the canyon. Elijah watched them go, then turned his attention to the narrow entrance where death was riding in. He chose his position carefully behind a tumble of boulders that provided good cover, while offering clear sightlines down the canyon throat. One man could hold this position against a dozen if he was good enough and lucky enough and didn't run out of ammunition. Elijah had been good enough for 12 years. Today he'd find out if he still was. The first rider came around the bend, cautiously, rifle up, scanning for threats. Elijah let him pass. The second rider followed, and the third. They spread out as much as the narrow canyon allowed professionals who knew they were entering a kill zone. Henderson came fourth, flanked by his last 2 men. 6 total. 1 more than Elijah had counted. He must have hired help in town after the shooting. Desperation making him stupid or smart enough to know he needed numbers. Elijah waited until they were all in the canyon throat, committed no easy retreat. Then he stood up. Thomas Henderson. His voice echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Every gun swung toward him. 6 weapons against 1. You're dead, whoever you are, Henderson screamed. You're a dead man. I've been dead for 3 years. Elijah pulled off the black mask, letting them see his face for the first time. Didn't take. Henderson's face went white. Even from 50 yards, Elijah could see the recognition hit, the sudden understanding of exactly how much trouble he was in. The Pale Rider, one of Henderson's men, whispered, "Sweet Jesus, it's the Pale Rider. Impossible." Henderson's voice cracked. He drowned. They found the body. They found a body. Elijah's voice was calm, almost conversational. Wasn't mine. For a long moment, nobody moved. The horses stamped and snorted, sensing their rider's fear. The wind carried the faint smell of sage and dust and the copper tang of blood that was coming. You're outnumbered, Henderson said, trying to rally. 1 man against 6. Those aren't odds. I've had worse. You're old, slow. 3 years of pretending to be a cripple. You probably can't even. Elijah drew. It wasn't the fastest draw he'd ever made. The years had taken something from him, some fraction of speed that he'd never get back. But it was fast enough. The first shot took Henderson's hired gun through the chest. He was dead before his body hit the ground. The second shot clipped another man's shoulder, spinning him off his horse with a scream. Then everyone was shooting at once. Elijah dropped behind his boulder as lead whined and sparked off the stone around him. He counted shots, 2 from each of the remaining men, maybe 3, calculating how many rounds they'd spent, how many they had left. A brief lull in the firing. Someone was reloading. He rose, fired twice, dropped back down. Another scream, another body hitting dirt. He's just 1 man, Henderson was screaming. Rush him. All at once, nobody rushed. The surviving men had seen what happened to those who underestimated the Pale Rider. They'd heard the stories, and now those stories were coming true right in front of their eyes. One of them broke, turned his horse and spurred it back toward the canyon entrance, abandoning Henderson and the others. Elijah let him go. A man running home to tell the tale was worth more than another corpse. That left Henderson and 2 others. Elijah waited, breathing slow and steady, listening for movement. His hands were rock steady despite the years, despite everything. Some things the body never forgot. "Henderson," he called out. "Send your men away." This is between you and me. Silence. Then Henderson's voice rough with fear and fury. What do you want? The woman and children go free. You ride out of Arizona and never come back. That's the deal. And if I refuse Elijah chambered another round, then I kill everyone here and take back what you stole anyway. The only difference is how many men you lose. More silence. Henderson was calculating, weighing his options. Why do you care about a bunch of Indian brats, he finally asked. They're nothing to you. Just Elijah's shot cracked off the rock inches from Henderson's head. They're children, he said. That's all they need to be. Henderson's remaining men were looking at each other now. Their boss's money wasn't worth dying for. Not against the Pale Rider. One of them made a decision. I'm done, he announced, holstering his gun. This ain't what I signed up for. You coward, Henderson screamed. I'm paying you to. You ain't paying me enough to fight that. The man nodded toward Elijah's position. I heard what he did to the Crawfords, to Senator Whitmore. I like breathing too much. He rode away, slow and steady, hands visible. Elijah let him pass. That left Henderson and one loyal man, the quiet professional, still alive despite the shoulder wound from the night before, still dangerous. Just you and me now, Henderson, Elijah said. And your pet killer. How do you want this to end? Henderson's answer was a gunshot, wild, desperate, nowhere near hitting anything. Elijah sighed. Fine. We do it the hard way. He moved low and fast, using the boulders for cover. 2 shots marked his progress as Henderson and his man tried to track him, both missing by feet instead of inches. They were scared. Fear made men sloppy. Elijah circled around, came up on their flank. The wounded man, he had skill that was clear, spotted him first, bringing his rifle up despite his injured arm. Fast. Very fast. But not fast enough. Elijah's bullet took him through the heart, and then there was only Henderson. The traitor was on foot now. His horse had bolted at the last exchange of gunfire, and he was backing away, his pistol shaking so badly he couldn't have hit a barn door at 10 paces. Please, he whispered. I have money. Lots of money. I can make you rich. I can. Elijah shot the gun out of his hand. Henderson screamed, clutching his fingers, stumbling backward until he hit the canyon wall. I don't want your money. Elijah walked forward, each step deliberate, closing the distance between them. I don't want anything from you. Then, what? What do you want? Elijah stopped 5 feet away. Up close. Henderson looked smaller, older. Just a man, really, a cruel, greedy, ordinary man who'd built an empire on human misery. I want you to understand something, Elijah said. Those children you stole, they have families, parents who will wake up every day for the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their babies, wondering if they're alive or dead or suffering in some minor brothel. Henderson's face twisted. They're just Indians. They're not even. Elijah's fist caught him in the jaw, snapping his head back against the rock. They're children. His voice was quiet now, more terrible for its calm. That's all they've ever been. All they needed to be. He raised his Colt. Henderson closed his eyes, waiting for the shot that would end his miserable life. It didn't come. No, Elijah said, lowering the gun. Killing you would be too easy. Too fast. He stepped back. Go. Walk out of here. No horse, no water, no supplies. Just you and the desert. Henderson's eyes flew open. That's a death sentence. I'll never make it to town. Then you'll die knowing exactly how those children felt. Alone. Scared. At the mercy of a world that doesn't care. Elijah holstered his gun. Start walking, Henderson, and pray the vultures don't find you before you find water. Henderson stared at him for a long moment. Hatred, fear, and something like understanding warring in his eyes. Then he started walking. Elijah watched until he disappeared around the canyon bend. Then he turned and went to find Kaya and the children. Behind him, the bodies of Henderson's men lay cooling in the Arizona sun. The killing was over. For now, the children clustered around Elijah when he appeared at the waterfall hollow, the 2 boys staring at him with something like awe, little Ayanna clinging to his leg like she'd never let go. Kaya stood apart, Henderson's men's guns collected at her feet. I heard the shots, she said. Then silence. I thought, it's over. Elijah knelt down gently, detaching Ayanna from his leg. Henderson won't bother anyone again. You killed him, no. Elijah looked at the children, at their wide dark eyes, at the hope that was slowly replacing their fear. I let him walk. The desert will do the rest. Kaya nodded slowly. A fitting death for such a man. Or he might survive, reach town, come back with more men. Elijah stood. We should move. Get you and the children back to your people. And you? He didn't answer immediately. The question cut deeper than he expected. For 8 months he'd been nobody. A blind watchmaker, invisible and harmless, waiting for death to finally catch up with him. Now that mask was shattered. Word would spread. The Pale Rider lives. Every bounty hunter, every lawman, every enemy he'd ever made would come looking. There was no going back to Bitter Springs. No going back to silence and darkness, and pretending he couldn't see. I don't know, he finally admitted. I'm not sure there's a place for me anymore. Kaya was quiet for a moment. Then, among my people, there is a word. We call it Hózhó. Roughly, it means balance, harmony, the path of beauty. A life in Hózhó is a life that serves its purpose. She gestured at the children at the canyon, at the bodies of the men who would have sold them into slavery. You think your purpose is violence, death, the gun in your hand. But look at what your violence achieved today. 4 children will grow up free. They will have families' future stories to tell their grandchildren. Elijah looked at Ayanna, who was staring up at him with eyes like midnight. The gun is a tool, Kaya continued. Nothing more. A hammer can build a house or break a skull. The hammer doesn't decide. The hand holding it does. That's a nice philosophy. Doesn't change what I am. What you are is a man who walked into death to save strangers. Kaya's voice was firm. That is not a monster. That is a warrior. I've been called that before. Usually by people I was about to kill. Then they saw true. She stepped closer. Among the Diné warriors are not judged by how many they kill, but by what they protect. You protected us. You could have stayed blind, stayed hidden, let Henderson take us to Mexico. Instead, you rose. Elijah had no answer for that. They left the canyon at dusk, traveling north through the cooling desert toward Navajo land. The children rode double on the captured horses, exhausted, but alive, their eyes fixed on the horizon where their homeland waited. Elijah rode beside Kaya, his duster coat gray against the gathering dark. Come with us, she said, as they crossed a dry wash. At least until we reach my people. They will want to thank the man who saved their children. I'm not sure thanks are what's waiting for me. A white man riding into Navajo territory with a gun. You will ride in with me. That is all the introduction you need. He wanted to argue. Wanted to say that he wasn't worthy of thanks, that he'd only done what any decent man would do, that the blood on his hands outweighed any good deed. But Ayanna was humming softly a Navajo song Kaya said one her mother sang to her every night before the raid, and the sound cut through all his arguments. Elena used to hum to Rosa, the same lullaby every night. Elijah had forgotten the melody until now, until this child brought it flooding back. Maybe that was what Hózhó meant. Maybe that was balance, the violence and the tenderness, the blood and the songs, the man who killed and the man who saved. Maybe both could exist in the same skin. All right, he said. I'll come. For a while. Kaya nodded, and something that might have been a smile touched her lips. They rode on through the gathering dark, the stars emerging one by one above them like ancient eyes watching their progress. Behind them lay the bodies of bad men and the wreckage of an evil enterprise. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility, just the possibility, of something like peace. Elijah Stone didn't know what waited for him in Navajo country. Didn't know if he'd stay a week or a year or the rest of his life. But for the first time in 3 years, he was riding toward something instead of running away. For the first time since Elena and Rosa burned, he was alive. Epilogue. 6 months later, the trading post at Window Rock was buzzing with the usual morning traffic. Navajo ranchers buying supplies, travelers passing through, children chasing each other between the wooden buildings. Nobody paid much attention to the tall man in the gray duster coat who walked among them. His eyes were blue as winter sky, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he was. But here among the Diné, he was simply Elijah, the watchmaker who fixed clocks and guns with equal skill, the quiet man who lived in the small hogan near Kaya's family, who taught the boys to ride and shoot, who told the elders stories of the outside world they had never seen, the man who some whispered had once been something terrible, and who had chosen to become something else. Ayanna found him that morning tugging at his coat with her small hands. Come, she said. Kaya says breakfast is ready. Elijah let the child pull him through the crowd, toward the hogan where smoke rose from the chimney, and the smell of fresh bread drifted on the breeze. Kaya was waiting outside, a smile breaking across her face as she saw them approach. She was beautiful in the morning light, stronger than she'd been in that canyon, healed in ways that went deeper than bruises and broken lips. She had begun teaching Elijah her language, the proper Navajo words instead of the pidgin he'd learned years ago. And sometimes at night they sat